Chapter 1. When Dionysus tried to start a vineyard in the desert. Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back to a time when gods were petty, deserts were dry, and people still thought pouring wine on the ground could solve emotional problems. So, dim the lights, settle in, and let's talk about a truly questionable life decision. When Dionysus, god of wine, decided to plant a vineyard in the middle of a desert. Because apparently, irrigation systems are for mortals, and divine confidence can fix everything. Now, if you've ever been slightly overambitious after a drink or two, like buying a domain name for your future candle empire, you'll understand Dionysus immediately. He wasn't just the god of wine, he was also the god of theater, madness, and questionable party management. The Greeks adored him for turning chaos into culture, but also blamed him when their hangovers felt divinely ordained. So, picture him now, a tanned, smirking deity with a laurel crown slightly askew, striding through the dust of the Near East with a group of ecstatic followers, half of them mortals, half of them probably hallucinations. They're sweaty, exhausted, and chanting his name as he waves a grapevine sprig around like it's a magic wand. Somewhere behind him, a satyr is fainting from heatstroke, and Dionysus is saying something like, "Don't worry, the grapes will grow. The sand just needs a little faith." The desert in question? Most versions say it was somewhere near Phrygia or maybe Libya. Ancient geography is famously imprecise, mostly written by people who'd never left the Mediterranean coastline. But all the versions agree. It was hot, barren, and not exactly wine country. Dionysus, being who he was, took this as a challenge. The myths always loved a divine overreaction. He wanted to prove that joy could bloom anywhere, even in the most joyless place imaginable, which, for him, meant somewhere without grapes. But before we get too far into the doomed horticultural experiment, let's float back a bit to his early years. Because like most Greek gods, Dionysus didn't start life in a calm, well-adjusted household. His family tree was a mythological soap opera that makes the Habsburgs look restrained. His father, of course, was Zeus, which already sets the tone for chaos. His mother was Semele, a mortal princess with, let's say, ambitious taste in partners. When Zeus decided to woo her, he did his usual trick of disguising himself as something impressive. This time, not a swan or a shower of gold, just himself, but dialed up to full king of the gods mode. Hera, Zeus's wife and eternal victim of his midlife crises, wasn't thrilled. She disguised herself as an old woman, whispered poisonous advice to Semele, and convinced her to ask Zeus to reveal himself in his true divine form. And because Greek mythology is allergic to happy endings, Zeus did, and she immediately incinerated. Dionysus, who was technically a fetus at the time, had to be rescued mid-combustion. Zeus, not being one for subtle solutions, sewed the unborn child into his thigh until he was ready to be born again. And that's how the god of wine entered the world, from a leg, fully aware that life was absurd. Fast forward a few decades. Dionysus is grown, flamboyant, and slightly unhinged in the best way. His followers, the Maenads and Satyrs, followed him across the world, spreading his cult of ecstatic worship. Their parties were loud, their behavior erratic, and their hangovers legendary. Dionysus didn't just bring wine. He brought the entire philosophy of losing yourself in emotion for better or worse. But for all his chaos, he wasn't all parties. There was something strange and melancholy about him too. Unlike most gods, he spent a lot of time among mortals. He wandered, taught people how to make wine, and occasionally turned arrogant kings into dolphins. Because nothing says divine punishment quite like permanent fish duty. Eventually, though, Dionysus got bored of the same rolling vineyards and wanted to test his power. He decided to take wine, his sacred art, somewhere new. Somewhere impossible. So, he led his followers east, across mountains and deserts, announcing that he would make vines grow in the sand. It's the kind of decision that sounds profound at midnight and deeply stupid by sunrise. But being immortal, Dionysus didn't have to worry about logistics. His followers, on the other hand, were dealing with dehydration and existential regret. They trudged behind him, delirious, clutching their thyrsi, those fancy ivy-tipped staffs, and muttering prayers that this would all end with an oasis. But all they found was endless sand. You can imagine the scene: divine optimism versus human reality. When they finally stopped, Dionysus dramatically plunged a vine cutting into the sand. He called on his divine heritage, the powers of nature, and probably a little theatrical flair. And to everyone's shock, or maybe hallucination, the vine actually sprouted. For a moment, it looked like he'd done it. The god of wine had defied the desert. The Maenads screamed with joy. Satyrs danced. Even the air shimmered with heat and triumph. But then, the vine wilted. The desert, predictably, didn't care for miracles. The sun baked it, the sand drained it, and soon it crumbled into nothing. Dionysus stood there, watching his little plant die in the dust, realizing perhaps for the first time that not even divine enthusiasm could outshine bad soil. This should have been a humbling moment. But gods, as a rule, don't do humility. Instead, Dionysus declared that the attempt itself was sacred. He decided the desert had been blessed by his presence, and thus, all future travelers through it should drink in his honor, which was a nice way to rebrand a failed experiment into a religious ritual. Some myths say that after this fiasco, he was approached by a figure named Silenus, a wise, perpetually drunk old satyr who became his tutor and drinking buddy. Silenus was famous for being both profound and incoherent, which honestly describes most philosophers after a few cups. He once told King Midas that the best thing for man is not to be born at all, which, in fairness, is a pretty bleak thing to say during a wine tasting. But it tells us a lot about Dionysus's vibe: joy mixed with despair, beauty laced with madness. His vineyard in the desert wasn't just a stunt, it was a statement that even in the most barren places, literal or emotional, you should at least try to find pleasure. Still, his followers were not convinced. Many of them wandered off, muttering about needing actual shade and drinkable water. But Dionysus didn't care. He'd already moved on to the next absurd adventure. Let's float over to one of those. Because wherever Dionysus went, someone inevitably underestimated him. Take, for example, the time he visited King Lycurgus of Thrace. Lycurgus didn't like the whole ecstatic, wine-fueled cult thing. He preferred order, control, and probably dry toast. When Dionysus showed up preaching freedom through intoxication, Lycurgus responded by imprisoning his followers and chasing the god himself with an axe. Faced with tears of joy, which, as it turns out, is a very bad idea, Dionysus fled temporarily, perhaps a little theatrically, into the sea, where he was comforted by the sea nymph Thetis. But when he came back, he didn't forget. He simply adjusted Lycurgus's reality a bit. The king went mad, started hacking at vines that he thought were enemies, and eventually, in one of those mythological oops moments, killed his own son by mistake. Afterward, the land of Thrace refused to grow crops until Lycurgus was gone. Even the earth, apparently, had a sense of divine drama. The moral, if you can call it that, is simple: don't annoy the wine god. He doesn't do forgiveness, he does performance art revenge. But through all of this, the deserts, the delusions, the divine chaos, Dionysus remains weirdly endearing. He's not a tyrant or a destroyer. He's more like that one friend who insists on turning a terrible idea into a meaningful experience. And maybe that's why his story lasted. The vineyard in the desert wasn't about grapes. It was about defiance, about creating joy in hopeless places, even when the result is wilted vines and regret. Because really, what's more human or divine than that? Chapter 2. The Kings Who Tried to Ban Wine and Failed Miserably. Let's drift gently onward. The desert vineyard had withered into myth, Dionysus had learned nothing from it, and humanity had gained a god who was both inspiring and slightly terrifying. The next logical step, apparently, was global outreach. Dionysus decided to spread his brand, joy, chaos, and questionable decision-making to the kingdoms of men. Now, this wasn't your average missionary work. There were no pamphlets, no door-knocking. His method was simpler: show up uninvited, throw a wild festival, and leave the local ruler questioning every decision he'd ever made. And for a while, it worked beautifully. Peasants loved him. Farmers adored him. The priests were confused but tipsy. The only people who consistently hated Dionysus were kings, which makes sense because his entire philosophy was the opposite of authority. Let's start with one of his most famous encounters, King Pentheus of Thebes. If you've ever read the Bacchae by Euripides, you'll remember Pentheus as the man who tried to stop a party and ended up very dead. But since this is bedtime history, we'll glide through it quietly, like gossip told after midnight. Pentheus was young, proud, and allergic to fun. He'd just taken the throne and was determined to make Thebes respectable again. Unfortunately, Thebes had recently been visited by Dionysus, who, in his usual dramatic fashion, announced himself as a new god and started converting everyone through ecstatic dance. The women of Thebes loved it. They left their homes, ran into the hills, and joined Dionysus's cult, known as the Maenads. The Maenads were famous for their wild rituals, which supposedly involved tearing apart animals with their bare hands, though that might just be Greek dramatization. In reality, they were probably just drinking too much and yelling at trees, which, to be fair, still looked like madness to the neighbors. Pentheus, ever the moral reformer, was horrified. He decided that all this divine partying was undermining the city's discipline. So he banned Dionysus worship, ordered his soldiers to arrest the participants, and gave a few speeches about decency. It was all very grumpy uncle at a wedding. Of course, Dionysus didn't take kindly to this. He disguised himself as a mortal priest and went to Pentheus in person, pretending to be a humble follower. Pentheus, in his arrogance, didn't recognize the god standing right in front of him. He questioned him, mocked him, and even had him imprisoned, which, for the record, is something you should never do to an immortal being who controls madness. Naturally, the prison didn't hold. The doors burst open on their own, the chains fell apart, and Dionysus stepped out looking annoyingly calm. Pentheus, meanwhile, started to unravel. He became obsessed with finding out what the Maenads were really doing in the hills. Dionysus, playing the long game, offered to take him there, if he dressed up as a woman to blend in. Now, Pentheus could have said no. He could have gone home, taken a nap, maybe had a cup of wine and reconsidered his anti-party policies. But no, he agreed. He let Dionysus dress him in a flowing gown and wig, and then the two of them snuck up the mountain together. You can imagine the sight, the stern young king teetering on sandals, pretending to be one of the ecstatic women he'd just outlawed. The god beside him, smirking. It's mythological irony at its finest. When they arrived, Dionysus revealed the truth that he'd been a god all along, and Pentheus was torn apart by the Maenads, including, tragically, his own mother. It's a grim story, but we don't need to linger on the gore. What matters here is the lesson, and it's the same one repeated through almost every Dionysian myth. Resist joy and you'll go mad. Embrace it and you'll still go mad, but at least you'll be having a good time. Thebes eventually learned to worship Dionysus properly. Temples went up, rituals were codified, and the cult of wine spread faster than a rumor in the Athenian agora. For a while, it looked like Dionysus had won. But of course, kings will be kings. And another one, Minius of Orchomenus, decided he'd had enough of all this ecstatic nonsense. His 3 daughters, known as the Maenads, refused to join the Dionysian rites. They stayed home, weaving in their quiet domestic virtue, while the rest of the women danced in the fields. Dionysus, being both sensitive and vindictive, didn't take rejection well. He visited them in disguise, sometimes as a young man, sometimes as a mysterious voice echoing through the room, and tried to persuade them to join. When they refused, he did what any mature deity would do. He drove them insane. Their looms began to drip with blood, their weaving turned into scenes of wild animals, and eventually they fled into the hills, possessed by the same frenzy they'd mocked. One of them, in her madness, even sacrificed her own child. When they finally regained their senses, they were transformed into bats, fluttering forever in dark places, afraid of the light. So yes, Dionysus had a flair for theatrical punishment. No quiet smiting or subtle karma here, he went full Greek tragedy every time. But beneath it all was a strange sense of balance. He wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. He was teaching the world to honor both reason and ecstasy, because when you deny one, the other devours you. And yet, not every ruler who met him ended up destroyed. Some actually embraced him, or at least learned to tolerate his divine chaos. The island of Naxos, for instance, became one of his sacred places. The people there welcomed him, gave him wine, and hosted elaborate festivals in his honor. In return, Dionysus gave them prosperity, good harvests, and presumably excellent hangover tolerance. It was on Naxos that another of his famous myths unfolded, his meeting with Ariadne. She was the daughter of King Minos of Crete, abandoned by Theseus after helping him escape the labyrinth. Heartbroken, she wandered the shore until Dionysus found her. The stories differ. Some say he fell in love instantly, others that he married her out of pity. Either way, he made her immortal, placing her crown among the stars as the constellation Corona Borealis. It's one of the rare gentle stories in his mythology. No madness, no vengeance, just a lonely mortal finding comfort in the company of a god. Even in his wildness, Dionysus had a streak of compassion. He wasn't just the god of wine, he was the god of relief, of the moment when pain softens into laughter, when exhaustion turns into song. But, inevitably, someone somewhere always thought they could suppress him again. Over in Lydian and Phrygian lands, the edges of the Greek world, he was seen as both foreign and frightening. His cult's ecstatic rituals seemed suspiciously un-Greek to conservative minds. Women leaving their homes to dance all night was, understandably, terrifying to patriarchal city-states built on order. So, once more laws were written, priests condemned him, soldiers tried to break up his rights, and, predictably, strange things began to happen. Rivers ran with wine. Ivy crept up palace walls overnight. The sound of flutes echoed in empty rooms. It was never violent, not at first. It was just eerie, a reminder that you could ban a festival, but not the human desire to forget your burdens. Dionysus's power wasn't in lightning bolts or armies. It was in the simple fact that everyone, at some point, wanted to let go. Even philosophers had trouble ignoring him. Plato, in one of his dialogues, called wine a gift of Dionysus, to remind us of the joy of the gods. Later Stoics tried to reinterpret him as a symbol of inner freedom, which is a polite way of saying they were tired of arguing with drunk people. And while Greece wrestled with the meaning of this strange, liberating god, Rome eventually imported him under a new name, Bacchus. The Romans, predictably, made things even more excessive. The Bacchanalia, his festivals, started as quiet, secretive rites. Then they grew into massive, chaotic parties with, according to Roman senators, mystery crimes and dangerous enthusiasm, which is Roman for people were having fun without permission. In 186 BCE, the Senate tried to ban the Bacchanalia altogether. They claimed it threatened public morals and state security, though one suspects they were just jealous of the attendance numbers. They executed priests, shut down temples, and passed strict laws limiting gatherings. But did it work? Of course not. You can't legislate against wine and gossip. The cult just went underground, merging with local traditions, hiding its songs in other festivals. By the time of Augustus, Dionysus, or Bacchus, had quietly reclaimed his place in art, poetry, and even imperial propaganda. Because even emperors liked the idea of a god who could turn suffering into celebration. It made for great symbolism and decent party themes. And so, century after century, the god of wine wandered from desert sands to royal courts, from secret rituals to public feasts, teaching the same quiet truth, that joy, however irrational, will always find a way to grow, even in barren places. And somewhere out there, in the soft dust of forgotten myths, that little desert vineyard probably still exists in spirit. Not alive, exactly, but remembered. A single vine that dared the impossible, planted by a god who never learned moderation. Chapter 3. When Rome got drunk and called it religion. The story of Dionysus doesn't end with Greece. Gods rarely retire, they just rebrand. When the Roman Republic rose to power, it absorbed everything Greece had to offer. The architecture, the philosophy, and of course, the gods. Zeus became Jupiter, Hermes became Mercury, and Dionysus got himself a Latin makeover as Bacchus. The name change didn't make him any less chaotic. If anything, Rome made him worse. Because the Romans, for all their discipline and military structure, were deeply contradictory people. They built aqueducts with mathematical precision, and then spent entire weeks hosting drunken festivals that made modern music festivals look like polite garden picnics. So when Bacchus arrived, the Romans didn't just accept him. They went all in. At first, the cult of Bacchus was small and secretive, mostly confined to women, slaves, and outsiders. The official religion of the Republic was rigid, formal, and state-controlled. You sacrificed an ox, you said the correct prayer, you went home. It was civic duty, not spiritual ecstasy. Bacchus was the opposite. His followers met at night, lit candles, played flutes, and drank wine until their inhibitions dissolved. To the Roman Senate, that was a political nightmare. Imagine a secret club where people of all classes and genders danced together, laughed at authority, and called it divine experience. For the senators, it wasn't just blasphemy, it was bad optics. So, naturally, they panicked. In 186 BCE, the Senate issued what became known as the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, a law banning the backsheik rites across Italy. It accused the cult of every possible scandal, orgies, conspiracies, even murder. Most of that was likely exaggerated, but the moral panic worked. Thousands of followers were arrested. Some were executed. Temples' hashtag were torn down. But here's the thing. Repression never kills joy. It just buries it for a while. Despite the crackdown, Bacchus didn't disappear. He just went underground. The rituals continued in secret, disguised as harmless festivals or folded into the worship of other gods. The Romans, being practical people, eventually gave up trying to stop it. By the time the Republic collapsed and Augustus took the throne, Bacchus had been quietly absorbed back into Roman life. His face appeared in mosaics, his symbols, ivy, grapes, the thyrsus, decorated villas, and bathhouses. Poets like Ovid and Virgil wrote about him with a kind of respectful mischief, as if they knew he was still watching from behind the wine cup. In art, Bacchus evolved. The Greeks had made Dionysus slim, dreamy, and faintly tragic, the god of beautiful madness. The Romans preferred him plump, smiling, and perpetually drunk, a god of abundance, not anxiety. They turned him from a mystical figure into a symbol of everyday pleasure. But even in this softer form, Bacchus retained his dangerous undertone. His festivals, now public again, always had that edge of frenzy, that sense that things could tip from celebration into chaos at any moment. The Roman historian Livy described how people lost themselves in backsheik rites. He meant it as criticism, but it's also a strange compliment. That loss of self was the point. To the Romans, wine wasn't just a drink, it was a metaphor for transformation. It took ordinary grapes and turned them into something divine. And Bacchus embodied that alchemy, the crossing of boundaries between mortal and God, reason and madness, control and surrender. As centuries passed, Bacchus's image began to blend with others. The old agricultural god Liber Pater, the free father, merged with him, creating a hybrid deity of liberty, fertility, and intoxication. During festivals like the Liberalia, young men offered honey cakes and wine, symbolically stepping into adulthood, which, judging by Roman behavior, mostly meant learning to drink responsibly, or at least pretend to. The backsheik spirit seeped into everything: theater, poetry, politics. Even emperors flirted with it. Nero, for example, styled himself as a kind of artistic Bacchus. He paraded through the streets dressed in vines and silk, declaring himself the god of music and beauty. People laughed, then died for it. Later emperors were more subtle, using backsheik imagery to suggest divine right and popular connection. Because nothing says benevolent ruler quite like comparing yourself to the god of intoxication. Still, there was something deeper happening beneath the wine and pageantry. The Roman world was changing. Empires grow heavy with their own order. The streets of Rome were crowded, the politics corrupt, and the people restless. In times like that, the appeal of Bacchus, of release, of forgetting, grew stronger. And as it turned out, he wasn't done influencing religion. When Christianity began spreading through the empire, its followers found themselves accused of the same things once said of Bacchus's cult: secret meetings, strange rituals, even accusations of orgies and cannibalism, which were, of course, complete misunderstandings of communion. The parallels weren't lost on anyone. Early Christian writers, like Clement of Alexandria, were so aware of the overlap that they went out of their way to separate Jesus from Bacchus. They called the wine of the Eucharist a symbol of divine truth, not ecstasy. But the association lingered. Both were savior figures who suffered, died, and returned. Both offered communion through wine. Both promised liberation from pain, one spiritual, the other sensual. And in art, the two even looked similar. The young, bearded Bacchus reclining among vines became a visual model for early depictions of Christ. Renaissance painters later leaned into it, blending the sacred and the sensual until the line between them blurred entirely. But before we drift too far ahead, let's linger a little longer in Rome, in the days when Bacchus's presence was both feared and desired. Because no matter how hard they tried to control him, he always found a way in. Take, for instance, the Roman household gods, the Laras and Penates. They guarded the home, the hearth, the pantry. People poured wine for them daily. Every dinner table, in a small way, became a baksheesh altar. The act of sharing wine, of toasting the living and the dead, was his quiet victory. Even the language of intoxication shifted. Words like liberare, to free, carried his echo. To drink was to loosen, to let go, to step closer to something divine. The Romans might not have called it worship anymore, but it was still ritual. And as the empire aged, Bacchus changed once again. His laughter softened into melancholy. In late Roman poetry, he appears less as a god of revelry and more as a ghost of forgotten joy, wandering through abandoned villas, vines overtaking marble. The parties had ended, but his spirit lingered, humming faintly through empty halls. When the empire finally fell, Bacchus didn't vanish. He simply went underground again, waiting. The medieval church tried, of course, to erase him. Pagan gods were rebranded as demons, their festivals renamed, their symbols repurposed. But wine was too central to get rid of. The church kept the drink and quietly kept the ritual. The chalice replaced the goblet, but the motion, lift, bless, drink, remained the same. And somewhere in that transformation, the old god smirked. He'd survived empires before. He could survive this too, because Bacchus, Dionysus, was never just a god of wine. He was the god of what wine represents: the blurring of boundaries, the surrender to feeling, the fragile thread between divinity and delirium. In that sense, he's eternal. Every glass raised in defiance of despair, every song sung a little too late at night, they're all echoes of him. And maybe that's why his myths endure. The vineyard in the desert, the maenads in the hills, the senators in panic, the monks raising cups in quiet reverence. All of it part of the same long, wandering story about how joy refuses to die. So the next time you see a carving of a smiling, vine-crowned figure in an old museum, know that he's still there, the god who turned madness into meaning and taught mortals to find beauty even in their breaking. And somewhere, in a sun-bleached dream of sand and grapes, his desert vineyard still waits for rain. Chapter 4: The God Who Wouldn't Stay Buried. When the Roman Empire finally dissolved into dust and fragments, it left behind temples, roads, and the faint hangover of too much civilization. Paganism was outlawed, old gods were exiled, and Christianity took center stage, calm, solemn, and determined to clean up the party that Rome had left behind. And yet, in some quiet corner of the human imagination, Dionysus, or Bacchus, or whatever name he was using at the time, refused to stay gone. The church could ban his festivals, but not the feeling that created them. Because beneath the hymns and incense, people still wanted what he had always offered: release, warmth, and the sacred permission to forget themselves for a while. Let's drift softly into the early Middle Ages, a time of monks, manuscripts, and moral panic. By all accounts, this should have been the end of Dionysus. But he survived in the strangest places. In vineyards, for instance. Monks across Europe took over the art of winemaking not because they missed the old gods, officially, anyway, but because wine was needed for Massachusetts. The Eucharist required it, and so, monasteries became the new guardians of the grape. It's an irony worthy of a myth itself. The same church that condemned backsheek revelry was now cultivating vast vineyards, perfecting fermentation techniques, and sipping cautiously in the name of God. If Dionysus had been watching, and perhaps he was, he must have been quietly amused. The robes were different, but the ritual remained. Grapes crushed, wine blessed, lips touched to the cup, eyes closed. Meanwhile, in medieval art, fragments of him kept slipping through. Old Roman mosaics were copied by Christian artists who didn't quite realize what they were looking at. A plump boy with grapes became autumn. A man crowned in ivy was reinterpreted as a figure of abundance. Bacchus had become allegory. He was no longer a god, but a symbol, still lounging in the margins, waiting. Even the literature of the period couldn't fully forget him. In the 12th century, European poets rediscovered classical texts. Latin scholars began reading Ovid again, and in those verses, Bacchus re-emerged, the eternal outsider, the divine fool, the lover of freedom and frenzy. By the Renaissance, he was back in the open. The artists of Florence and Rome were obsessed with reviving antiquity. They studied marble torsos, painted mythic feasts, and found in Bacchus a figure who embodied everything their age adored: beauty, pleasure, contradiction. Sandro Botticelli painted nymphs dancing through orchards that might as well have been backsheek processions. Leonardo da Vinci sketched a languid, smiling Bacchus, and if you look closely, you'll see his typical ambiguity. Half man, half woman, neither drunk nor sober. A divine being who seemed to question the boundaries of everything. Then there was Michelangelo's Bacchus, carved around 1497, standing with one leg bent, his head tilted, a faint smile curling across his lips. He holds a cup aloft as if toasting you, but his eyes are glazed. The marble seems to wobble slightly, as though even stone can't stand upright after too much wine. It scandalized the critics of its time. They called it indecent, unbalanced, too human. Which, of course, meant Michelangelo had captured Dionysus perfectly. For Renaissance thinkers, Bacchus wasn't just the god of wine anymore. He had become the god of art itself, of inspiration, of divine madness, of the fragile line between genius and delirium. Writers like Erasmus and later Giordano Bruno hinted that backsheek ecstasy might be a kind of truth, a way of knowing the world beyond logic. Even the church couldn't resist him entirely. Painters working for popes continued to include him, discreetly, in their mythological commissions. Raphael's graceful nymphs, Titian's flushed Venuses, Caravaggio's brooding young Bacchus. They were all variations on the same eternal theme, beauty touched by intoxication. Caravaggio's version, in particular, feels intimate. His Bacchus is not a god but a boy, pale, drowsy, draped in a loose robe, holding a bowl of wine. The fruit beside him is slightly overripe. His expression hovers somewhere between invitation and exhaustion. He looks, in a way, hungover on existence. And maybe that's why he kept coming back. Not because people wanted to worship him, but because they recognized themselves in him. Bacchus was human in a way other gods weren't. He didn't demand perfection, he offered permission. Permission to feel too much, to break composure, to love foolishly. As Europe moved into the Baroque and beyond, Dionysus evolved again. He became a symbol of contradiction, sensual yet sacred, chaotic yet redemptive. In the 17th and 18th centuries, as rationalism tightened its grip, artists and philosophers began missing him all over again. The Enlightenment talked about reason, progress, and order, all the things Dionysus traditionally destroyed. But you can't reason your way through longing, and the more the philosophers praised logic, the more the poets started sneaking wine into their verses. By the late 18th century, he'd found new disciples, not in temples, but in taverns and drawing rooms. The Romantics. They didn't call him Bacchus anymore. They called him inspiration, or creative madness, or simply the muse. But the essence was the same. When Lord Byron described his restless heart, when Shelley wrote of ecstatic union with nature, when Goethe's Faust spoke of desiring knowledge beyond limits, That was Dionysus whispering again, reborn in poetry. It's strange how a god can shapeshift through centuries, trading temples for metaphors, vines for verses. But that's what he always did best, reinvent himself through the human need for joy, even forbidden joy. And he was still everywhere if you looked closely. The village wine festivals that blessed the harvest. The laughter spilling from taverns on holy days. Even the stained glass chalices in cathedrals, colored red like old grapes. The line between sacred and profane had blurred again, and Bacchus was smiling in the haze. By the dawn of the 19th century, scholars rediscovered him formally. German thinkers like Winckelmann and later Nietzsche began to talk about the Dionysian spirit, a force of chaos and emotion that stood against the Apollonian, the spirit of order and reason. But that's a thought for another night. Because for now, in the quiet centuries between the collapse of Rome and the rise of modernity, Dionysus had done what few gods ever manage. He adapted. He hid in the vineyards, sang through the painters, whispered in the poets' ears, and found sanctuary in every place that beauty and longing collided. The church had its saints, the scholars their systems. But the people, they still had their wine, their laughter, and that old, unshakable impulse to dance barefoot on forbidden ground. And somewhere, between the chime of the church bells and the clink of a cup, Dionysus lived on. Chapter 5. The Philosopher's Hangover. By the time the 19th century rolled in with its trains, gas lamps, and inconveniently sober industrial spirit, Dionysus should have been long forgotten. The world had become practical, predictable, mechanized. People had factories instead of festivals, ledgers instead of lyres. And yet, under all that iron and steam, something restless still stirred. Europe, for all its progress, felt dull. The Enlightenment had taught people to think, but not necessarily to feel. Everything was being measured, classified, labeled, and improved. It was the age of reason, and reason, as it turned out, was terrible at handling loneliness. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that artists and philosophers started drinking again. Not just literally, though that certainly helped. Metaphorically, spiritually, they began reaching for that old, half-forbidden intoxication, the one that reminded humanity that joy and madness sometimes came from the same cup. And from this yearning rose a curious, bespectacled German man who would accidentally resurrect a god. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche was not exactly the kind of person you'd expect to be hosting a backchic revel. He was thin, perpetually ill, and famously awkward in conversation. He once proposed marriage to the same woman 3 times, and was rejected all 3 times. That woman, Lou Salome, ended up running off to study psychology with Freud instead, which feels like the perfect 19th century breakup. But despite the migraines, the loneliness, and the social anxiety, Nietzsche had one of the wildest imaginations in philosophy. And in 1872, he wrote The Birth of Tragedy. In it, he split the world into 2 forces, 2 spirits, that he believed defined all of art, all of life, and maybe even the universe itself. On one side was Apollo, the god of light, clarity, and reason, the sculptor, the order bringer, the dream of harmony. And on the other was Dionysus, the god of chaos, ecstasy, and dissolution, the one who made you forget yourself, who blurred the line between pain and pleasure, who reminded you that you were part of something larger and uncontrollable. Nietzsche argued that Greek tragedy, those old plays of gods, kings, and doom, was great not because it was beautiful, but because it balanced those 2 forces, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, reason and rapture, order and release. But modern society, he claimed, had lost its Dionysus. It had become sterile, logical, and repressed, too Apollonian, as he put it. The modern man, Nietzsche thought, needed to drink from the old god's cup again. It was a scandalous idea. In an age obsessed with progress and morality, Nietzsche basically said, "You've become too sober. You need a little divine madness back in your system." Of course, most people didn't take kindly to that. Universities dismissed him. The clergy despised him. His friends quietly backed away. But Dionysus, that eternal shapeshifter, had found a new prophet. Nietzsche's Dionysus wasn't just about wine and dancing anymore. It was about embracing life in all its contradictions. He saw in the gods something deeply human, the acceptance of both suffering and joy, tragedy and triumph. The willingness to say yes to existence even when it hurt. In later years, Nietzsche even started identifying himself with the god. In his final letters, written just before his mind gave out, he signed them Dionysus, as though the boundary between philosopher and deity had blurred completely. It's tragic, but also fitting. Nietzsche's descent into madness mirrored the very chaos he had celebrated. Dionysus, it seems, doesn't grant enlightenment gently. But philosophy wasn't the only place the god reappeared. He was also seeping into art, music, and literature again, quietly, insistently, like a vine growing through stone. In poetry, the Romantics had already prepared the ground. Lord Byron's reckless passion, Shelley's idealism, Keats's odes to pleasure and decay, all of them carried that same Dionysian longing for transcendence through beauty. Even in painting, he showed up again. 19th century artists, tired of the academic stiffness of neoclassicism, turned to myth as an excuse to explore sensuality and emotion. Take Lawrence Almadima, who filled his canvases with languid Romans lounging around marble terraces, goblets in hand. His backchic scenes weren't wild, they were dreamy, almost narcotic. The kind of luxury that feels like falling asleep in sunlight after too much wine. Meanwhile, in France, artists like Gustave Moreau painted Dionysus as a vision of mystery, glowing, androgynous, surrounded by strange creatures and half-forgotten symbols. He was no longer a rustic god of the vines. He had become a symbol of desire itself, elusive, dangerous, and beautiful. Then came the symbolists, those melancholy late 19th century poets who turned Dionysus into something darker, the embodiment of creative madness, of art that consumes its maker. To them, intoxication wasn't a joy, it was a necessity, a way to escape the suffocating dullness of bourgeois life. Even music caught the fever. Richard Wagner, Nietzsche's idol before they dramatically fell out, built operas that felt like Dionysian rituals, huge, loud, emotionally unhinged. Nietzsche initially adored Wagner's chaos, but later decided it was all too theatrical. The philosopher wanted ecstasy, Wagner wanted applause. Still, the fact remains, the late 19th century was drunk on Dionysus, even if no one admitted it outright. And then came the 20th century, with its wars, machines, and neuroses, and suddenly everyone was talking about the irrational again. The unconscious, the animal within. Freud turned Dionysus into psychology. Jung turned him into archetype. Artists turned him into rebellion. In the smoky cafes of Paris, the surrealists toasted him nightly. They didn't call it that, of course. They called it automatic writing, or artistic freedom, or creative anarchy. But what they were really doing was chasing the same divine madness, the moment when logic falls away and something wilder takes over. Even the counterculture of the 1960s, all that psychedelic haze, that insistence on experience over structure, was a kind of modern Dionysian revival. The god had gone electric, traded ivy for incense, and was now whispering through guitars instead of lyres. It's strange how persistent he is. Every few centuries, people declare him dead. Every time, he shows up again at the next after-party. He doesn't need temples anymore. He lives in concerts, in poetry, in every moment where someone lets go of control long enough to feel alive. And yet, there's a melancholy to it, because Dionysus never stays for long. His ecstasy always burns out. Nietzsche ended in silence. The Romantics drowned, died of fevers, or simply faded into cynicism. The modern world turned his festivals into nightlife and his rituals into marketing. He's always being resurrected and always misunderstood. But maybe that's the point. He's the god of impermanence. The moment between sense and surrender. The sweetness just before the hangover. So when we talk about Dionysus trying to start a vineyard in the desert, maybe that's what we really mean. The endless attempt to plant joy in a world that keeps drying out. To make something wild grow where it shouldn't. And despite everything, the philosophers, the wars, the factories, the fluorescent lights, he keeps doing it. The grapes keep growing. The wine keeps pouring. The song, somehow, goes on. Chapter 6. The God in the Mirror. By the early 20th century, Dionysus had fully traded his ivy crown for a therapist's couch. He wasn't dancing in the vineyards anymore. He was sitting quietly in the collective unconscious, waiting for someone to notice he was still there. And someone did. Carl Jung, Freud's moody, mystical protege, began to explore the deep architecture of the human mind. He talked about archetypes, the ancient, recurring figures that live in all of us, shaping our dreams and myths whether we like it or not. And among those shadowy presences, Dionysus was unmistakably one of the loudest. Jung saw him as the symbol of what happens when you let go of control. The loss of ego, the moment of surrender to something vast and irrational, the collective unconscious, as he put it, but really just another name for the divine chaos Dionysus had always ruled over. For Jung, the god wasn't just about wine. He was about transformation, death and rebirth, the disintegration of self before renewal, which, if you think about it, sounds suspiciously like both therapy and a really good bottle of red. Jung even hinted that the modern world needed Dionysus, not as a literal deity, but as a psychological necessity. He warned that by suppressing the irrational, emotional, instinctual part of ourselves, we risked becoming brittle, mechanical, and spiritually starved. In other words, he saw what Nietzsche had seen, but with less shouting and more dream analysis. Meanwhile, outside the clinics and the lecture halls, artists were rediscovering Dionysus in their own messy ways. Painters like Picasso were tearing apart form and logic. Cubism was a kind of drunkenness, breaking the world into fragments and rearranging them into something alive again. Poets like T. Eliot and Ezra Pound built verses out of ruins, echoing the collapse and rebirth that defined Dionysian myth. Even modern dance, all twisting bodies and raw emotion, was, at its heart, a return to the ancient ecstatic. And then there were the writers. James Joyce, for instance, essentially wrote a modern Bakshi hymn in Ulysses. A single day of wandering, drinking, lusting, remembering, all through the fog of consciousness. His characters stagger through Dublin as if through a myth, searching for connection in the mundane. Or take D.H. Lawrence, always writing about the body as a site of sacred rebellion. His novels were banned not because they were obscene, but because they were honest about how much people still longed for transcendence through touch, through instinct. And yet, even as modernity embraced its wild side again, it kept trying to explain it, to intellectualize it, to make sense of Dionysus instead of simply dancing with him. Freud, ever the scientist, reduced ecstasy to libido. Surrealists turned spontaneity into manifesto. Even psychology, for all its insight, began classifying madness as pathology rather than mystery. Dionysus was being studied, not worshipped. Catalogued, not celebrated. But every so often he'd slip through again, in moments of art or music that reminded everyone he wasn't gone, just hiding. You can hear him in jazz, the improvisation, the risk, the way melody dissolves into emotion. You can hear him in the Beatles' later albums, in the psychedelic swirls of Tomorrow Never Knows, that hypnotic, spiraling surrender to something larger. You can see him in the smoky photographs of 1960s concerts, the swaying crowds, eyes closed, bodies moving as one. The modern Bakshi writes, now with electric amplifiers. Even cinema, that new temple of light and illusion, found him irresistible. Ingmar Bergman explored his duality in films like The Seventh Seal and Persona, where reason and chaos, identity and dissolution stare at each other until the boundary breaks. Pier Paolo Pasolini, the Italian director who could never resist scandal, made Theorem, a film where a mysterious stranger seduces an entire bourgeois family and, through pleasure, reveals their spiritual emptiness. If that's not a modern Dionysian visitation, nothing is. And of course, there's the infamous 1969 film Dionysus in 69, a chaotic stage adaptation of Euripides' The Bacchae, where the audience was invited to join in the ritual, literally merging with the performance. It wasn't acting, it was invocation. But perhaps the most quietly telling image of Dionysus in the modern age isn't in any gallery or movie. It's in the mirror. Because somewhere between Nietzsche's wild affirmations and Jung's archetypal psychology, Dionysus stopped being an external god and became an internal one. He became the part of each person that refuses to live only by reason. The part that grieves too deeply, loves too recklessly, dreams too vividly. The part that still believes in transformation, even in a world made of steel and statistics. In that sense, every artist, every dreamer, every person who's ever stood too long at the edge of beauty or madness, they're all little fragments of Dionysus. And yet, modern life does its best to silence him. The fluorescent lights hum too loud. The clocks tick too fast. There's no time for ecstasy when emails exist. So he hides. In wine glasses, in music festivals, in midnight walks when the city finally goes quiet. In the private sighs of people who've spent all day pretending to be rational. He's there, waiting, patient, eternal. Sometimes he's gentle, a whisper reminding you to breathe. Other times he's destructive, tearing down the masks we build to survive. But he's never gone. In a way, Dionysus has become the perfect god for a secular world. Because he doesn't demand belief, just honesty. You don't have to pray to him. You just have to feel something real, even for a moment. He's in the breakdown after a long week, the dance you didn't plan, the art you make without thinking, the tears you can't explain. He's in the truth that leaks out when logic fails. And maybe that's why, after thousands of years, he still hasn't disappeared. The old gods of thunder and war need temples, armies, and followers. But Dionysus only needs one thing: a human being willing to feel too much. He doesn't care if you're an artist or an accountant, if you're sober or spinning. The invitation is the same: to step out of the rigid story for a while, to dissolve into something greater, wilder, softer. He's not here to destroy civilization. He's here to remind it what it's for. So when you catch that sudden urge to dance in your kitchen, or cry at a song you've heard 100 times, or stare at the sunset like it's whispering secrets, that's him. Still wandering. Still starting vineyards in deserts, against all odds. Because the desert, after all, is just a place that forgot how to bloom. And Dionysus, patient, persistent, quietly divine, never stops trying to make it remember. Chapter 7, Vineyards of Burnout. The modern world doesn't have much use for gods anymore. It has algorithms instead. Calendars that sync across devices. Productivity apps that promise enlightenment through efficiency. Meditation timers that chime politely, reminding you to breathe between emails. It's not that we've stopped worshipping, we've just changed altars. And in this quiet, humming age of work and Wi-Fi, Dionysus feels like an uninvited guest at a corporate retreat. He doesn't fit the dress code. He shows up barefoot, late, probably holding a bottle of something unapproved by HR. He doesn't believe in goals or metrics. He believes in release, which makes him, of course, a complete liability. But he's still here, watching from the edges as humanity tries to engineer happiness. You can almost hear him sigh when he looks at modern leisure. Vacations booked 6 months in advance. Self-care scheduled into Google Calendar. Digital detox, retreats where people pay to experience silence, then post about it later. It's not that Dionysus disapproves. It's just not his kind of chaos. His kind is older. Messy. The kind that sneaks up when the playlist hits the right song and you forget for a second that you have a meeting in the morning. The kind that lives in laughter that lasts too long, or tears that come out of nowhere, or that 1 hour of night when everything feels strangely meaningful. Because somewhere deep in the collective human rhythm, the god of ecstasy is still pulsing. Quietly, persistently. Let's float there for a moment, into the strange modern contradiction, how we're surrounded by abundance but starved of meaning. We have more information than any civilization before us. We can scroll endlessly through art, music, words, images. And yet, it all moves too fast to sink in. The ancient experience of awe, of standing before something that takes your breath away, has been replaced with content. And what's more anti-Dionysian than that? For millennia, Dionysus represented the sacred loss of control. Now we live in an era obsessed with control. Tracking steps, counting calories, monitoring sleep cycles. Even joy is quantified. measured in likes, shares, engagement rates. The modern grapevine has turned into a data network. But deep down, something ancient still aches for the old chaos. You can see it in the strange new rituals that have replaced the old ones. Music festivals, for example, hundreds of thousands of people covered in glitter and dust, moving together in hypnotic unison, losing themselves under pulsing lights. You can call it entertainment, but it's closer to the backy than anyone wants to admit. The same frenzy, the same suspension of ego, the same need to forget yourself in the crowd and be part of something larger. The difference is, now the tickets are $500, and someone is definitely live streaming it. Dionysus doesn't mind. He's adaptable. He'll take the form he can get. But even he might smirk at how tidy our chaos has become, curated, sponsored, branded. And then there's burnout, the great plague of the modern soul. The quiet exhaustion that comes not from toil, but from the endless pretending that we're fine. In the old myths, Dionysus punished those who resisted him. Pentheus tried to deny him and ended up torn apart by his own mother, driven mad. The lesson was simple: repress ecstasy, and it comes back as destruction. Modern burnout is just a subtler version of that. We resist rest, resist emotion, resist vulnerability, until one day, the mind simply snaps. The breakdown isn't punishment. It's the inevitable balancing act of an overworked world that forgot how to breathe. And when it happens, when people finally collapse under the weight of perfection, Dionysus is there, quietly waiting with a hand out. He doesn't fix anything. He never has. But he offers something the spreadsheets can't: the permission to stop, to cry, to laugh, to sit under the weight of being alive and not try to optimize it. Maybe that's what his vineyard in the desert really means now: the insistence that beauty and joy can grow even in a place designed to crush both. In a sense, the modern desert isn't made of sand, but of schedules. Endless digital plains where time stretches flat and dry, and every hour looks like the next. And yet, people still plant things there. Artists still paint. Musicians still write songs that sound like prayers. Strangers still fall in love for no practical reason. The vines still find water somewhere. That's the quiet miracle of Dionysus. He doesn't conquer, he seeps in. Slowly, softly. Sometimes he's a sudden laugh in a meeting you're not supposed to enjoy. Sometimes he's the warmth of a glass of wine shared with someone who understands without words. Sometimes he's a night where you finally sleep without dreaming of deadlines. He doesn't demand worship, just honesty. Because if there's one thing Dionysus despises, it's pretense. He's the god who strips away masks, gently, sometimes painfully, but always truthfully. He reveals the person underneath all the roles: worker, achiever, adult. He finds the child that still wants to dance. That's why he keeps returning even when no one calls his name. The human spirit, despite its apps and analytics, still craves mystery, still aches for surrender. It's not a moral failing. It's biology. It's myth. It's memory. When the ancient Greeks drank in his honor, they weren't just celebrating intoxication, they were acknowledging something fundamental about existence: that joy and sorrow are intertwined, and that sometimes the only way through one is by embracing the other. That truth hasn't changed. It's just harder to see through fluorescent light. So maybe the vineyard in the desert isn't about rebellion at all. Maybe it's about patience. About the God who understands that joy takes time to grow. That even the driest life, the most overworked, overtired, overconnected existence, still has roots somewhere deep, reaching for water. And when the rains finally come, a small kindness, an unexpected laugh, a song that makes you cry, Dionysus smiles. Because he knows the vines will bloom again. He's eternal not because people keep naming him, but because they keep needing him. Every time someone breaks the pattern, turns off the phone, steps outside, breathes, feels, the vineyard grows a little more. It's slow work. But then, Dionysus has always been patient with deserts. Chapter 8. When the god goes quiet. At some point, somewhere between the music fading, the glasses emptying, and the world returning to its regular rhythm, Dionysus always slips away. He doesn't make a dramatic exit. He never has. He just fades, like laughter dissolving into silence, leaving behind the faint scent of grapes and something you can't quite name. It's easy to think he's gone when that happens. The world sobers up, the lights come back on, and everyone shuffles home. Life resumes its practical shape. The spreadsheets return. The inbox fills. But if you listen closely, you can still hear him. Not as a voice, he's too subtle for that. More like an echo. A reminder that once, you felt something larger than yourself, and it mattered. That's the thing about Dionysus, he was never really about wine. Or even pleasure. He was about the permission to be whole. To be both ecstatic and exhausted, both broken and beautiful. And that's what makes him eternal. Most gods fade when belief fades. Dionysus doesn't need belief. He thrives in experience. Wherever there's music, or grief, or art, or even just an unguarded moment of truth, he's there, invisible but palpable, like a warmth you can't explain. It's almost funny, really. The ancient Greeks built entire rituals for him. Processions, dances, songs. And now, after thousands of years, he's still showing up to house parties and poetry readings, concert halls and quiet kitchens. Humanity keeps changing, but his invitations are still the same. Come feel something real for a while. He doesn't care if it's pretty. He doesn't even care if it's joyful. He only cares that it's alive. Because for all his chaos, Dionysus has always been a god of life, of resurrection, of return. The vines that die each winter and come back in spring. The heart that shatters and still finds a way to love again. The world that keeps spinning no matter how tired it gets. And that might be his gentlest lesson, that joy isn't the opposite of suffering. It's what grows beside it. The vineyard doesn't erase the desert. It just refuses to let it win. Let's float for a while on that thought, that maybe the divine isn't loud or distant. Maybe it's quiet, small, something that hums softly beneath ordinary life. You can find it in the way the morning light lands on a table, in the warmth of tea held between your hands, in a memory that still aches but kindly now. That's him too, Dionysus, resting. He doesn't always demand a festival. Sometimes he just asks you to notice, because ecstasy isn't only found in frenzy. It can be in stillness too, the peaceful kind, the kind that comes when you stop trying to hold everything together. The kind that feels like release without movement. Maybe that's what the god was trying to start all along. Not just a vineyard in the desert, but a way of being that could hold both drought and bloom. Even now, the desert remains vast. The world still runs on deadlines and noise. But somewhere, quietly, the vines are growing again. You can almost imagine him there, bare feet on warm sand, head tilted back, watching stars that have seen empires rise and fall. There's no audience, no frenzy, just stillness, and the soft wind brushing past. And maybe, after all this time, that's his final transformation. Not the god of madness, or wine, or even art, but the god of return, of coming back to yourself after the chaos, of remembering that even in exhaustion, there's life humming underneath. Because the truth is, Dionysus never really tried to conquer the desert. He just wanted to remind it that once, it was fertile. And maybe, somewhere inside you, that's still true too. The desert isn't endless. The vines haven't died. They're just sleeping, waiting for the next rain. So if tonight, as you lie there in the dark, you feel a faint, inexplicable calm, a little warmth where there wasn't any before, it might just be him. Chapter 9, the whisper of forgotten gods. Even after centuries of wandering through vineyards, cities, and mines, Dionysus is not the only god quietly persisting. In the shadows of history, other deities linger, less celebrated but equally patient, like notes at the edge of a song you can almost remember. Hermes, for instance, the messenger god, never left. He's the one slipping through alleys, whispering secrets to those who listen. You don't always see him, you feel him in sudden insights, the unexpected answer that arrives just in time, or the strange coincidences that nudge your life along without explanation. He's been present in every letter delivered, every network of trade, every serendipitous encounter that felt like more than chance. And that's the thing about these gods, they adapt. They hide in modern life, sometimes masquerading as intuition, inspiration, or creativity. They have no temples now, only patterns in our routines that remind us of them. The clink of a glass, the flash of a dream, the fleeting joy of noticing something ordinary with wonder. In some ways, their persistence is gentle, subtle, almost imperceptible. They are not there to disrupt the world violently anymore. They are patient, waiting for someone to pause, notice, and remember the rhythms that once defined existence. Dionysus taught us about ecstasy, chaos, and renewal. Hermes teaches us about movement, connection, and timing. They are complementary in a way. One teaches surrender, the other teaches flow. Both remind us that even in the hum of daily life, something larger is always at work. We rarely pause to acknowledge them. Our screens, our schedules, our routines, they drown out the whispers. And yet, every time we stop for a moment of wonder, a flash of insight, a small act of surrender to life's mystery, we are hearing them. Even in sleep, they linger. In dreams that feel both strange and inevitable. In sudden insights that arrive without effort. In the quiet of night, when the world is soft and waiting. And perhaps that's the final lesson of a God who tried to plant a vineyard in the desert. The divine does not always manifest loudly. Sometimes it manifests as patience, persistence, and quiet insistence. It shows up in the human heart long after the festivals have ended, the temples have crumbled, and the textbooks have moved on. Dionysus may not sweep across deserts anymore with revelry and frenzy. Hermes may no longer fly between Olympus and Earth delivering messages with speed and cunning. But they remain, in us, around us, through us, waiting for our attention, and sometimes, just sometimes, offering the gentle reminder that life can still surprise, delight, and nurture even in the most arid landscapes of modern existence. So if tonight, as you lie there drifting toward sleep, you feel a sudden warmth or a fleeting sense of presence, it might just be them, not here to demand, but to remind. Not here to command, but to whisper. Quietly, patiently, eternally. Chapter 10. The Slow Pulse of Eternity. By now, if you've been listening closely, you might notice a rhythm, a quiet pulse that underlies the noise of modern life. It is subtle, almost imperceptible, like the beat of a distant drum carried through centuries. That pulse is the persistence of the divine in forms we've almost forgotten, or perhaps never fully recognized. Dionysus, Hermes, and their forgotten kin are not absent. They are woven into the texture of existence, threading through our routines, our art, and even our dreams. The modern world loves efficiency. It loves answers, productivity, and certainty. And yet, the rhythm of the gods, of myth, ritual, and ecstasy, refuses to be confined to schedules or algorithms. It flows in moments when we least expect it. The sudden clarity in the middle of a mundane task, the laughter that surprises us, the inexplicable connection with a stranger. These are the echoes of a vineyard planted millennia ago in a desert that never truly existed, except as a metaphor for human forgetfulness. Even science, which often prides itself on reason, cannot fully silence this pulse. Neurobiology tells us that humans are wired for reward, for pleasure, for creativity, for storytelling. Psychologists map the unconscious, and poets capture fleeting truths. Every time we respond to beauty, experience catharsis, or surrender to wonder, we are participating in the same rituals Dionysus began centuries ago, though without ivy crowns or ceremonial feasts. And it is not just joy that he governs. He has always presided over duality, pleasure and pain, creation and destruction, freedom and surrender. Hermes, too, brings dualities, speed and delay, communication and miscommunication, trickery and revelation. Together, these ancient presences remind us that life cannot be fully tamed. It can be studied, optimized, and controlled only so far. Beyond that, it flows as it will. This is perhaps why myth persists, even when belief fades. The gods, once thought of as separate beings, are in fact reflections of the human experience itself. Their stories, absurd and tragic, mirrored the contradictions of existence, the beauty of imperfection, the inevitability of loss, the unexpected grace of small miracles. Listening to them is less about devotion and more about remembering that life is both fleeting and eternal, fragile and inexhaustible. We can trace the pulse into modern creativity. Musicians channel the ecstasy of Dionysus without naming him. Writers and artists, knowingly or not, echo Hermes' cunning in the structures of their work, in the timing of revelations and the movement of ideas. Festivals, concerts, quiet readings, impromptu dances, they are the modern temples where the gods linger, invisible but present. And yet, there is a melancholy in this subtlety. The world has changed. The ancient rituals have been replaced by convenience and distraction. Phones buzz, deadlines loom, and the quiet moments when one might feel the presence of these old energies are fewer and farther between. The gods do not vanish, but their whispers can be drowned out. It takes attention, a willingness to pause, to notice, to let the pulse flow unimpeded. Perhaps that is the final lesson of Dionysus' Vineyard, Hermes' messages, and the slow pulse of eternity. The sacred is not always grand or obvious. It is often quiet, hidden in small acts and fleeting experiences, waiting patiently for recognition. Life's beauty is measured not only in great moments of triumph or ecstasy, but in these subtle, persistent threads that connect past and present, myth and memory, human and divine. And so, if you lie awake tonight, or drift into sleep and feel a warmth, a rhythm, a fleeting insight or joy, it is worth remembering. The gods have never truly left. They are there in your laughter, in your sorrow, in your art, in your wonder. Quiet, patient, unassuming, eternal. Dionysus is still tending his vineyard. Hermes is still delivering messages through the improbable coincidences of your day. And in their quiet persistence, they remind us that life is not just to be endured or optimized, but to be felt deeply, messily, beautifully. The world may demand efficiency and order, but the pulse of the gods is ineffable, unstoppable, and infinite. And if you listen, just for a moment, you can feel it too. Chapter 11, Royal Grapes and Melancholic Kings. As we drift back from modern reflections to the past, it's time to float gently into the quiet absurdities of European royalty. Monarchs who, in their peculiar ways, seem to embody some version of Dionysian chaos without ever stepping foot in a vineyard. Their lives were a vineyard of human frailty, each vine winding toward melancholy, indulgence, or simple absurdity. Let's begin with Charles VI of France, known to history as Charles the Beloved, before circumstances demanded a revision, the Mad. He ruled at the turn of the 15th century, a king whose mind would not remain tethered to reason. There were days when he believed he was made of glass, tiptoeing through his palace for fear of shattering. On other days, he would dress as a commoner, wandering the streets unnoticed, though he was, in fact, the king. Imagine the courtiers' confusion, dutifully bowing to a glass king 1 hour, then having him brush past them as if they were invisible the next. The madness was not a brief eccentricity. It lasted decades, punctuated by bouts of rationality that made each relapse even more bewildering. And yet he ruled France through it all. Not always effectively, but somehow. There's a quiet tragedy in that immense power paired with a mind that refused its constraints, a personal vineyard overrun with wild, unpredictable vines. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Richard III of England managed to cultivate a different sort of reputation. Shakespeare painted him as a hunchbacked villain, scheming with murderous intent, but history, as always, prefers nuance. Richard was, in many ways, a product of dynastic pressures, family betrayals, and a society that demanded ruthless precision. Yet there were strange moments that hint at eccentricity bordering on Dionysian mischief. A fondness for pageantry, an obsession with jousting, and the theatricality of his public persona. He orchestrated politics like a performance, and in doing so, he both dazzled and terrified. Let's float softly to Austria, where Charles II of Spain, a man affectionately called El Hechizado, the Bewitched, lived in a court that was, in some sense, the world's most carefully tended vineyard of inbreeding. Every generation of Habsburgs seemed determined to perfect the royal line, and nature, predictably, had other ideas. Charles II was frail, malformed, and ultimately unable to father an heir. Yet he carried the crown as best he could, a tragic figure in a lineage obsessed with control and perfection. The quiet absurdity is unavoidable. Entire dynasties shaped by human ambition, undone by the very laws of biology they tried to ignore. In Scandinavia, we encounter Christian VII of Denmark, a king whose court was rife with intrigue and melancholy. Christian suffered from mental instability, which ranged from mood swings to severe delusions. He was surrounded by ministers and favorites who controlled the machinery of government while he wandered through palaces, often engaging in bizarre, sometimes comedic, rituals. It's tempting to imagine him as a kind of human Bacchus, detached from reality, indulging in whims, yet unknowingly shaping the history of his country. And then there's Ludwig II of Bavaria, the fairy tale king who preferred castles to crowns. Ludwig's life was a gentle, opulent surrender to aesthetic pleasure. He built fantastical palaces that seemed to float above reality itself. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee. His obsession with art, music, and drama earned him the label of eccentric or mad, but perhaps he simply recognized the need for beauty in a world increasingly pragmatic. Ludwig's reality was a private vineyard of indulgence, isolated yet profoundly human. A quiet rebellion against the ordinary, a slow dance with fantasy itself. Even in the British Isles, eccentricity flourished. George IV, Prince Regent before he became king, indulged in lavish parties, fashion, and indulgent pleasure. The Regency era was his backchic playground, a time of excess, style, and scandal. He pursued art, architecture, and social spectacle with the single-minded devotion of someone attempting to cultivate beauty against the inevitable entropy of courtly life. And yet, behind these anecdotes lies a common thread: the human desire to escape, to indulge, to find some fleeting pleasure or meaning amidst the rigid structures imposed by power and duty. In every palace, in every court, these monarchs planted their own vineyards, some in glass castles, some in shadowed corridors of the mind, and tended them as best they could. Some yielded chaos. Some yielded beauty. Most yielded both in equal measure. Even when the world demanded efficiency, order, and rational governance, these rulers clung to personal rhythms, private indulgences, and eccentric rituals. They remind us, quietly, that human life, even at its most controlled, carries within it the seeds of unpredictability, the urge for beauty, the need for small, personal ecstasies. And in that sense, they were not unlike Dionysus himself. Their madness, whimsy, and longing reflect the same duality: pleasure and suffering, illusion and truth, chaos and careful cultivation. Each royal life becomes a microcosm of the vineyard in the desert, a place where wild growth persists, where beauty is found in unexpected places, and where life refuses to be fully tamed. Chapter 12. Inbred Crowns and Curious Habits. As we linger in the slow corridors of European courts, it becomes clear that monarchs have always been an odd mix of grandeur and fragility. The further back we go, the more their lives resemble a carefully cultivated vineyard, each generation a new row, pruned for power, watered with alliances, yet inevitably overrun by wild, unexpected growth. Take the Habsburgs, for instance. The dynasty was obsessed with keeping bloodlines pure, marrying cousins and second cousins over and over, like vintners who refused to import new grape varieties. The result was, as historians politely put it, less than optimal. Prominent members developed distinctive jawlines, speech difficulties, and mysterious ailments. Charles II of Spain, whom we met before, was perhaps the most extreme example, unable to walk properly, frail in every possible way, and ultimately childless. His court must have felt like a slow-motion Greek tragedy, a kingdom built on careful planning, undone by the simple, relentless rules of genetics. Then there was Maria Theresa of Austria, whose long reign, 1740 to 1780, combined diligence with a kind of relentless maternal intensity. She produced 16 children, marrying most of them strategically to cement alliances across Europe. Imagine raising 16 royal children while simultaneously managing an empire. It's exhausting just to picture. And yet, She was intensely hands-on, personally supervising the education, court etiquette, and even medical care of her offspring. The dynasty may have been a living chessboard, but she was determined to keep every piece in line. For all her control, nature and circumstance still threw in chaos, ensuring that her carefully pruned vineyard would always have a few rogue vines. Speaking of rogue vines, let's drift to Peter the Great of Russia, a man whose eccentricity borders on Dionysian. Peter was obsessed with modernizing Russia, cutting beards, founding new cities, introducing Western fashions, yet he could also be capricious, cruel, and impulsive. He held elaborate parties where etiquette and revelry collided, mingling sailors, nobles, and foreigners in a cacophony of order and chaos. He exemplifies the paradox of monarchs, the simultaneous desire to control everything and the irrepressible urge to indulge whims. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, perfected this dynamic. The court at Versailles was an artful exercise in control, yet the king's personal tastes, for drama, ballet, and elaborate feasts, turned the palace into a perpetual festival. Every day was a performance. The nobles were trained to dance, bow, and display devotion at all times. And yet, behind the choreography, Louis indulged in secret amusements and whimsies that kept the court guessing. His life, like a vineyard, was meticulously structured, yet impossible to fully tame. In Britain, the Hanoverians brought their own peculiarities. George III, for instance, suffered from periodic bouts of mental instability, what might have been porphyria, we now speculate, which could leave him withdrawn, erratic, or unpredictable. The monarchy had to accommodate both the image of stability and the reality of unpredictability, a delicate balance reminiscent of tending vines that refuse to grow straight. His family life was similarly intense, with 15 children and the constant pressures of dynastic politics. Yet within that framework, there were eccentricities. George III was an avid gardener and deeply involved in his own scientific experiments, tending plants and observations with almost obsessive care. His private passions were his vineyard, a small oasis of control in a life otherwise dictated by duty. Then there's Frederick the Great of Prussia, whose personal habits were equally curious. An accomplished military strategist and ruler, he nonetheless preferred the company of musicians and philosophers to that of generals. He had long, reflective walks where he conversed with ideas more than people, and an intimate circle of friends who indulged his tastes for poetry, music, and contemplation. While the battlefield required precision, the private court was a vineyard of intellectual and aesthetic indulgence, cultivated with care and eccentricity. And the queens were no less remarkable. Catherine de' Medici, often vilified for her political intrigues, was deeply involved in culinary innovation, astrology, and ceremonial spectacle. Her influence extended from court life to the kitchens and gardens of France, shaping culture in ways that were subtle yet persistent. Elizabeth I, ruling England centuries later, used ritual, costume, and spectacle to maintain authority, blending pragmatism with personal expression. Even the smallest details, a gown, a procession, a carefully delivered speech, became part of her cultivated vineyard, each act tending to both appearance and legacy. In these courts, we see a pattern emerge, life measured in ceremonies, extravagance, and subtle rebellion. Monarchs were both gardeners and vines, meticulously managing appearances while still subject to the unpredictable growth of personal whim, biological reality, and historical circumstance. It's easy to imagine these courts in slow motion, the rustle of silks, the faint scent of incense and wine, the quiet plotting, the obsessive attention to detail, the occasional burst of chaos when a royal whim collided with expectation. Each palace a microcosm of the human condition, beautiful, rigid, absurd, fragile, and alive. And through all of this, one can detect the faint echo of Dionysus, not as a god of open revelry, but as a reminder of the ever-present unpredictability of life. In the careful pruning, the hidden indulgences, the eccentric habits, and the inevitable failures of control, these royals were unknowingly dancing with the same dualities the god embodied: order and chaos, pleasure and suffering, life meticulously cultivated yet inevitably wild. Chapter 13: tragic heirs and cursed marriages. In the slow, measured world of European royalty, heirs were never just children. They were symbols, investments, and, sometimes, vessels of quiet tragedy. The palace corridors echoed not only with ceremony but with anxiety, each birth a potential miracle, each illness a potential disaster. And while courtiers planned alliances with the precision of vintners selecting grapes, nature had its own stubborn will, producing outcomes both absurd and heartbreaking. Consider Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, the ill-fated rulers of France. Their marriage was arranged to cement alliances between Austria and France, a political vineyard meticulously cultivated by diplomats and family councils. But the personal reality was another matter entirely. Louis, shy and introverted, struggled with intimacy, while Marie, young and lively, tried to navigate a court rife with intrigue and scandal. Their children, too, became pawns in the relentless machinery of monarchy. The eldest, Marie-Therese, survived the revolution, but her siblings perished in childhood or tragedy. A family carefully arranged for stability ultimately yielded chaos, illness, and grief, a vineyard overtaken by wild, uncontrollable vines. Similarly, Ferdinand VII of Spain presided over dynastic pressures that were almost farcical in their absurdity. His marriages were arranged for political gain, but personal happiness was elusive. One wife died young, another was forced into exile, children were lost to disease, and the court buzzed with rumor and scandal. Despite attempts at control, the human heart proved far less tractable than any edict or treaty. Ferdinand's reign, like the carefully pruned royal vineyards of his ancestors, was ultimately subject to the unpredictable rhythms of life. In England, the tragedy of Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, highlights how personal misfortune could ripple outward through dynastic calculations. Eldest son of the Prince of Wales, he seemed destined for the throne, yet died young from influenza before ever assuming power. His death reshaped the line of succession, eventually placing George V on the throne, and quietly shifted the course of British history. Royal planning, no matter how meticulous, was always at the mercy of chance and disease. Meanwhile, in the courts of France, Louis XIV's own family illustrates both control and tragedy. The Sun King's obsession with dynastic succession produced numerous children, but not all survived childhood. One can almost imagine Versailles as a vineyard, each child a carefully nurtured vine. Yet some inevitably withered despite the king's power, the court's resources, and the best medical knowledge of the era. The grief of loss was compounded by the necessity of performance. Kings and queens were expected to mourn discreetly, to maintain dignity, while the inner turmoil of family life remained largely invisible. Dynastic disasters were often compounded by inbreeding, a practice designed to preserve power but often yielding unpredictable consequences. The Habsburg jaw, the neurological conditions, the frailty of heirs, these were the vines that resisted pruning, the chaotic branches in an otherwise orderly vineyard. In many cases, rulers were left with no choice but to navigate these challenges quietly, under the public gaze, while personal sorrow festered in silence. Take the example of Queen Victoria's descendants. Victoria herself married Prince Albert, a choice guided by both affection and politics. Their 9 children were dispersed across European courts, cementing alliances. Yet inbreeding among some of these lines introduced physical and mental health issues in later generations, illustrating the tension between dynastic strategy and the inexorable unpredictability of biology. Behind stately portraits and ceremonial appearances were real human consequences, suffering, illness, and loss that could never be fully managed. In Scandinavia, Christian IX of Denmark, known as the father-in-law of Europe, provides another case study. His children married into nearly every European royal house, creating an intricate network of alliances. Yet even within this carefully cultivated dynasty, tragedy was never absent. Early deaths, illness, and political pressures shaped lives in ways that could not be controlled, no matter the careful selection of partners or strategic planning. And then there were the more eccentric, quietly absurd examples. Monarchs whose personal whims produced lasting, if unintended, consequences. Charles II of Spain, for example, with his physical frailty and childlessness, inadvertently became the final piece in the Habsburg genetic puzzle, leaving Europe's dynasties scrambling to adapt. His life was a quiet testament to the limits of control and the stubborn power of nature over human design. Through all of these examples, one notices a pattern. Royal life, for all its trappings of grandeur, is profoundly human. The carefully curated rituals, the relentless planning, the obsession with legacy, all exist alongside frailty, unpredictability, and loss. The dynastic vineyards, no matter how carefully tended, always contain wild branches, diseases, and unexpected twists. And in this gentle absurdity, there is a kind of resonance with Dionysus, the god who first attempted to plant vineyards in impossible deserts. These monarchs, in their meticulous planning and private indulgences, were dancing with their own forms of chaos, sometimes unknowingly, sometimes desperately, always in the shadow of forces they could not fully command. Even in the quiet corridors of palaces, the echoes of laughter, grief, and human whimsy remind us that monarchy, like myth, is as much about the unpredictable heart as it is about power. Each heir, each marriage, each carefully drafted treaty was part of a slow, intricate dance. A vineyard of human experience where control was never complete and life always found a way to surprise. Chapter 14. Eccentric halls and curious pastimes. As we drift deeper into the lives of European monarchs, it becomes apparent that royalty, despite its rigid protocols and ceremonies, was fertile ground for eccentricity. Beyond the throne room, beyond the public ceremonies, there were private habits, peculiar hobbies, and strange rituals, quiet rebellions against the structure of duty, or perhaps subtle invitations to the chaotic, Dionysian side of life. Take Frederick II of Prussia, known as Frederick the Great, who spent long hours composing music, conversing with philosophers, and cultivating a personal affinity for the arts. The battlefield demanded his precision, but in his private chambers, he pursued the slow pleasures of music and reflection with obsessive care. He surrounded himself with flutes and harpsichords, hosting impromptu concerts where the generals and courtiers could marvel at his skill or occasionally suffer through it. These private indulgences, carefully nurtured, were his vineyard, small, cultivated, and defiant in their detachment from statecraft. Then there's Louis XIV, whose court at Versailles was a stage of meticulous choreography, but whose personal whims sometimes contradicted the rigid order he demanded. He insisted on elaborate rituals, from the carefully timed waking of the king to the precise order of meals and processions. Yet he delighted in private theatrics, in secret amusements, and in moments of theatrical indulgence that flouted even his own courtly rules. The Sun King's obsession with grandeur was inseparable from his personal eccentricities. His love of ballet, music, and architecture created a palace that was both structured and endlessly playful. Across the Channel, George IV of England indulged his aesthetic obsessions with unprecedented extravagance. Fashion, architecture, and social spectacle were his domains, and he pursued them with a single-minded dedication that sometimes bordered on obsession. The Prince Regent's private parties, lavish gardens, and commissioned artworks reveal a man both aware of his power and keenly intent on shaping beauty to his personal taste. In his eccentricities, there is the same quiet echo of Dionysian indulgence, pleasure cultivated as ritual, yet infused with unpredictability. In Austria, Maria Theresa's court was a blend of order and obsessive attention to personal routines. While the queen supervised the education, etiquette, and medical care of her 16 children, she also indulged in personal rituals, careful dress, devotion to her religious practices, and a constant presence in the detailed workings of court life. These practices, though seemingly rigid, allowed for private expressions of control and care, a cultivated vineyard of domestic management in the midst of political power. Meanwhile, in Bavaria, Ludwig II stands out as perhaps the most romantic and solitary of monarchs. His obsession with fairy tale castles, from Neuschwanstein to Herrenchiemsee, demonstrates a mind that sought refuge in beauty and imagination. Ludwig's life was structured yet whimsical, isolated yet immersive, a perfect example of a royal vineyard overrun with personal fantasies. His eccentricities, nocturnal walks, elaborate theatrical productions, obsessive correspondence with Wagner, were both an escape and a cultivation of private ecstasy. Other monarchs indulged in curious hobbies with quieter, subtler eccentricity. Peter the Great of Russia was famously fascinated with shipbuilding and European technology, often immersing himself in manual labor alongside his subjects. Charles II of England delighted in science experiments and the patronage of the early Royal Society, blending curiosity with playful indulgence. Catherine de' Medici of France explored culinary innovation and astrology with personal fervor, embedding herself in areas of life that would normally remain unseen by public eyes. These eccentricities share common traits. They were private, they were obsessive, and they were deeply human. They offered monarchs moments of respite from the rigid demands of governance, a way to cultivate personal joy or fascination within the confines of an intensely public life. And in each case, there is a quiet resonance with the ancient god who loved the wild, the unexpected, and the ecstatic, a reminder that even the most controlled life contains the seeds of chaos and delight. Even the rituals of daily court life, when observed closely, reveal similar patterns. Morning routines, elaborate meals, hunting expeditions, and ceremonial processions were simultaneously exercises in discipline and subtle performances of personal taste. Monarchs negotiated protocol and power while leaving space for private indulgences. A game of music, a private conversation, a secret amusement. In these small moments, the court became a vineyard of human desire, cultivated, pruned, and yet inevitably wild. The eccentricities also remind us that royalty, for all its ceremonial rigidity, was deeply human. Monarchs laughed, wept, obsessed, and indulged in pleasures that often seemed absurd when viewed from the outside. Their lives were microcosms of the human experience, the tension between order and chaos, duty and desire, appearance and private truth. The private hobbies, peculiar pastimes, and unusual routines were not merely quirks. They were attempts to navigate existence, to plant beauty, and to find meaning in a world dominated by protocol. And so, the quiet, slow-motion absurdities of royal life continue to echo through history. In the private halls, the shadowed gardens, the hidden chambers, monarchs cultivated their own vineyards, some orderly, some chaotic, some tragic, some joyful. The legacy of these eccentricities is a reminder that human life, even at its most elevated, is never entirely under control. Even when power dictates the shape of the public world, the private heart remains untamed. The monarchs we've met, Frederick the Great, Louis XIV, George IV, Ludwig II, Peter the Great, Catherine de' Medici, all demonstrate the quiet, persistent presence of the personal, the absurd, and the Dionysian in history. In these halls, in these habits, we glimpse the slow pulse of humanity itself, a rhythm that persists regardless of titles, crowns, or centuries. A rhythm that bends, sways, and sometimes bursts into secret, unexpected life. Chapter 15. The Final Vintage. As we reach the gentle closing of this long, meandering journey through vineyards of gods and monarchs, it's worth pausing to reflect on what we've witnessed, not as a story of triumph or defeat, but as a slow, careful meditation on human life in its most cultivated and chaotic forms. From Dionysus planting vineyards in deserts that may have existed only in myth, to Hermes delivering whispers we barely notice, to the kings and queens of Europe tending their dynastic rows of children, alliances, and peculiar habits, a pattern emerges. Life, whether divine or mortal, is a blend of order and unpredictability, of careful cultivation and inevitable wildness. Consider the monarchs we have floated past. Charles VI tiptoeing in glass slippers through Versailles, Maria Theresa managing 16 children with the precision of a master gardener, Ludwig II wandering dreamlike through castles that defied gravity and reason. Each of them, in their way, planted a vineyard, sometimes literal, sometimes metaphorical, and each vineyard produced both fruit and folly. The same hands that tried to control destiny were often the ones that allowed it to run wild. Even the tragedies are softened when observed slowly, without judgment, as if viewed through the quiet haze of evening. Heirs lost to illness, dynasties tangled in inbreeding, marriages arranged with little thought to personal happiness. These are the shadows that make the sunlight of eccentricities and indulgences meaningful. Without the difficulties, the small joys would lose their subtle brilliance. The courtiers' whispered rumors, the clandestine music sessions, the midnight walks through gardens, all of it gains significance only in contrast to the rigid expectations and sorrow that surround them. The gods, of course, remain patient observers. Dionysus, Hermes, and others have no need to shout. Their influence persists in laughter, insight, music, art, and in the quiet moments where life reminds us that joy can coexist with sorrow, indulgence with restraint, freedom with duty. Their vineyards, whether of grape, child, or idea, grow slowly, persistently, even in soils that seem inhospitable. It's tempting to draw a neat moral from all this, but that would be to miss the point. The beauty is in the gentle absurdity, the interplay between control and chaos. The lesson is not prescriptive, it's observational. Life is neither fully orderly nor entirely wild. It exists in the slow rhythm of repetition, indulgence, and unpredictability. It is the careful tending of a vineyard in a desert, the quiet enjoyment of a private chamber, the subtle laughter at a courtly mishap. As night falls and the world softens, we can imagine the gods reclining just beyond perception, watching as humans plant their own vineyards of habit, art, and whimsy. Monarchs may fade, dynasties may crumble, but the rhythm persists. The vines continue to grow, unseen yet persistent. The quiet indulgences of life, those small, intimate pleasures, remain our tether to the eternal pulse that flows beneath the surface of history. So, as you lie back and let the weight of this long meditation settle, remember, the world has always been a vineyard. Some vines are meticulously pruned, some grow wild, some are diseased, some bloom brilliantly for a moment before fading. The point is not to harvest everything perfectly, nor to mourn the failures. The point is to notice the growth, to find joy in the peculiarities, to allow for indulgence, and to recognize that even in the desert, something will always bloom. Dionysus smiles quietly at this enduring truth. Hermes winks from a shadowed corner. And the long, sleepy corridors of palaces, vineyards, and myth remain open, waiting for the next soul to wander through, notice the vines, and perhaps, for a moment, surrender to the gentle rhythm of life's absurd beauty. And with that, we leave the vineyards behind, not as a conclusion but as a quiet invitation, to slow down, to observe, and to remember that even in the most ordered or desperate of circumstances, life, like a persistent vine, will always find a way to grow, bloom, and surprise. Chapter 16, Echoes in the Quiet. Even after the vineyards have been planted, tended, and sometimes overrun, their influence persists, not loudly, not dramatically, but in whispers, shadows, and quiet gestures. The lives of Dionysus, Hermes, and the peculiar monarchs we've drifted past continue to ripple softly through time, touching the smallest details of ordinary existence. Consider the faint echo of a royal habit in modern life, a meticulously arranged tea table, an elaborate dinner party, or the obsession with order in an otherwise chaotic day. Perhaps it is the subtle joy in collecting objects, arranging books, or curating playlists, private rituals that mirror the eccentric indulgences of monarchs long gone. These are the secret vineyards of contemporary life, cultivated quietly, often unnoticed, yet persistent. And the myths themselves linger. Dionysus' insistence on ecstasy, Hermes' sly interventions, and the tragic whimsy of European courts find their reflections in literature, music, film, and art. A story of star-crossed airs, a sudden revelatory insight, or a private indulgence in a work of beauty, these are modern manifestations of the same rhythms we've observed in myth and monarchy. The pulse is the same, only slightly altered by time and circumstance. Even human behavior bears traces of these influences. The desire for order and control, balanced against indulgence and whimsy, is universal. We structure our lives carefully, yet allow for chaos. Birthdays, holidays, secret passions, minor rebellions against routine. These patterns, subtle as they are, echo the private indulgences and eccentricities of kings and queens, of gods who danced in deserts, and of mythic presences that refused to be fully tamed. History, then, is not only a series of dates and events but a living, breathing vineyard. Each person contributes their own vines, their own careful cultivation, their own wild growth. And like the gods and monarchs we've met, these contributions are a mix of beauty and absurdity, control and chaos, ephemeral pleasure and quiet melancholy. Even in the quietest moments, the turning of a page, the hum of an evening, the fleeting inspiration of a thought, one can feel the resonance of those long-past lives. Dionysus' vineyards may have been metaphorical, Ludwig II's castles fantastical, Charles II's frailties tragic. Yet all remain present in the slow, subtle rhythms that shape experience, reminding us that life is rarely straightforward, never entirely controllable, and endlessly rich in its eccentricities. And so, as night deepens and the world softens, we leave with the gentle understanding that nothing truly disappears. The vineyards, the castles, the gods, the monarchs, they live on quietly, in the overlooked, in the habitual, and in the intimate. Their presence is a soft pulse beneath ordinary life, a reminder that joy and indulgence, chaos and beauty, can always be found if one simply pays attention. Perhaps, in the end, that is the final lesson of this long, slow journey, to notice the quiet growth, the subtle absurdities, the delicate indulgences, to recognize that even in routine, even in duty, there is life that refuses to be entirely controlled. Like a vineyard in the desert, it persists, patiently, quietly, and unexpectedly, awaiting those who will pause to see it, feel it, and remember it. Chapter 17. The Lingering Hum. Even after centuries of stories, myths, and dynastic dramas, there remains a subtle hum, a faint vibration in the background of life that most people never consciously notice. It is the pulse of indulgence, whimsy, and quiet eccentricity carried forward from Dionysus' vineyards, from Hermes' secretive messages, and from the private corridors of royal palaces long since fallen into silence. You might sense it in ordinary things. A lingering taste of wine at the end of a meal, the careful arrangement of objects on a desk, the unexpected thrill of noticing a fleeting detail in nature, or the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly executed ritual in your daily life. These small pleasures, imperceptible to most, are echoes of ancient impulses, the same impulses that once governed gods, kings, and queens. Even in the mundane, the patterns persist. The urge to curate, to celebrate, to find beauty, or to indulge in harmless rebellion has not disappeared. It has merely moved quietly into the rhythms of human life. The solitary dancer spinning in a kitchen, the painter immersed in color at midnight, the writer scribbling thoughts in a notebook. They are all cultivating their own tiny vineyards, tending vines that refuse to be fully tamed, that grow wild and unexpectedly fruitful. History itself is nothing more than the record of these subtle pulses. The great battles, treaties, and coronations matter, of course, but the enduring thread is the human response, the whimsy, the indulgence, the quiet obsession, and the persistence of desire and creativity. Dionysus' revels, Hermes' clever interventions, Ludwig II's castles, and Charles II's frailty, they all converge into a single truth. Life cannot be completely controlled, and neither should it be. And yet, the hum is not loud. It is gentle. It requires attention, a willingness to pause, to notice, to feel. It is present in the night, in the quiet corners of our minds, in the moments when the world softens and time seems to stretch. The divine, the royal, and the eccentric do not vanish. They linger, tucked into the edges of consciousness, like vines growing unnoticed along a stone wall. So as you drift toward sleep, allow yourself to sense it. Allow the hum to flow through your thoughts without effort. Recognize that life is both cultivated and chaotic, that indulgence and restraint coexist, and that small moments of joy or whimsy are themselves a kind of quiet immortality. Dionysus smiles somewhere unseen. Hermes passes by unnoticed. The kings and queens we have met nod from long-forgotten chambers. And beneath the ordinary, the faint hum continues, patient, gentle, and eternal. Chapter 18. The quiet vineyard. There remains a quiet vineyard in the world, a space of small rituals, private pleasures, and unnoticed wonders. It exists in corners of our lives, in the habits we nurture, in the fleeting beauty we pause to observe. The echoes of Dionysus' vineyards, Hermes' whispered messages, and the eccentric indulgences of monarchs have not vanished. They have simply adapted. They appear in moments of gentle curiosity, in the joy of a perfectly arranged bookcase, in the thrill of discovering a forgotten melody, or in the quiet humor of an absurd thought that passes almost unnoticed. These are the hidden vines that persist, winding through ordinary life with subtle grace. Even the smallest gestures, tending a plant, sketching in a notebook, lingering over a cup of tea, carry the lineage of ancient indulgence. They are reminders that life is not only measured in grand accomplishments or dramatic events, but in the quiet, persistent cultivation of beauty, comfort, and whimsy. The human impulse toward creation and pleasure is itself a vineyard, sprawling and resilient, flowering in unexpected places. History, myth, and royal eccentricities converge here. They remind us that imperfection is inevitable, that chaos and order coexist, and that indulgence, in small or large forms, is not merely frivolous but essential. The glass-footed king, the mad Habsburg, the dreamer Ludwig II, their lives, with all their strange habits and private joys, are proof that life thrives when it is allowed room to wander, grow, and bloom. And so, as night deepens and the world grows soft around you, imagine the quiet vineyard stretching out beneath your awareness. Feel the subtle rhythm of the ages, of gods, kings, and ordinary people alike, flowing beneath your own breath. Recognize that indulgence, whimsy, and patience are not lost arts, but ongoing presences, gently shaping life even when unnoticed. Dionysus grapes may never fully ripen in the desert, Hermes' messages may remain unseen, and the kings and queens of old may rest in stone halls long abandoned. Yet the essence remains, the quiet persistence of beauty, joy, and gentle absurdity. It lingers in us, in our routines, our private pleasures, our soft attentions, like vines that refuse to die. In this quiet vineyard, all is patient, all is gentle, all is continuous. Life, like the slow growth of a vine, continues in the most ordinary and extraordinary ways. And if you pause, if you breathe, if you notice, you can feel it, the enduring, subtle presence of what once was, what is, and what quietly persists in the hum of existence itself. Chapter 19. The Last Tendings. As the night deepens and the world slows, there is time to notice the smallest details, the sway of a vine in a forgotten garden, the faint glimmer of light on a polished surface, the soft murmur of life moving gently through ordinary spaces. These are the last tendings of the vineyard, quiet, deliberate, and persistent. Even as dynasties crumble, castles crumble, and myths fade into memory, the essence of indulgence and quiet care lingers. It lives in the small rituals that humans continue, arranging objects with care, savoring a warm drink, lingering on a line of poetry, or taking a slow, deliberate breath. These acts, subtle and almost invisible, are echoes of gods and kings, of vineyards tended long ago in deserts of imagination and reality alike. The kings and queens we've met, with their glass footsteps, eccentric hobbies, obsessive routines, and secret indulgences, are gone, yet their presence survives in the pattern of human life. Every carefully tended habit, every small indulgence, every quiet rebellion against routine is a tiny vine that stretches through time. These are the living remnants of what was once extraordinary, now ordinary, yet endlessly persistent. Dionysus' vineyards, Hermes' messages, Ludwig II's castles, Charles II's fragile body, all have dissolved into the landscape of memory, yet they leave a residue, a pulse that continues. It is not dramatic, not loud, but steady, gentle, and reassuring. Life persists in the same way, quietly, unexpectedly, in both ordinary and extraordinary forms. As you breathe, notice the calm, the small rhythms of your own body, your own mind. The pulse of life, human, divine, absurd, and gentle, continues, flowing quietly beneath thought, beneath awareness. All that has been tended, planted, and indulged persists, not in grand displays, but in subtle, intimate, enduring patterns. And so, the vineyard rests, the corridors of palaces echo faintly with memory, and the gods, kings, and eccentric souls smile quietly from just beyond perception. The world is calm. The vines grow. The rhythms persist. All is quiet. All is gentle. All is enduring. Chapter 20, The Gentle Closing. Now, as the final threads of our long, wandering journey begin to settle, we come to a place of quiet reflection. The vineyards of Dionysus, the whispered interventions of Hermes, the eccentric corridors of palaces long abandoned, all linger in memory, but they also persist in the small rhythms of life today. Even without crowns or mythic robes, the impulses they embodied remain: the desire for pleasure, the need for indulgence, the small joys that exist quietly in everyday life. They appear in a perfectly brewed cup of tea, in the careful arrangement of a desk, in a melody caught on the wind, or in the soft laughter at a private joke. These tiny gestures are the final tendings of the vineyard, subtle and enduring. The monarchs we met, fragile, eccentric, brilliant, and absurd, remind us that life is never entirely predictable. They taught us that control and chaos coexist, that beauty and folly often intertwine, and that small indulgences are not merely frivolous, but essential. Their private habits, their obsessions, and their quietly tragic mistakes are part of a larger pattern, a slow rhythm we can still recognize. And so, as you lie back and feel the quiet settle around you, imagine the soft rustle of leaves, the distant glimmer of sunlight on stone halls, the faint pulse of vines stretching across centuries. Everything that was, everything that is, continues in subtle ways. The human spirit, like the vineyard, grows quietly, resiliently, and sometimes unpredictably, flowering in unexpected corners of life. There is no need for loud conclusions or dramatic flourishes. The lesson, if it can be called that, is gentle and persistent. Life is a mix of order and whimsy, diligence and indulgence, seriousness and absurdity. Attend to the small pleasures, the quiet joys, the unnoticed details. Let the rhythms of time and human folly wash softly over you. Dionysus smiles, Hermes moves unseen, and the kings and queens of old rest in their chambers, their influence subtle but enduring. The vineyard exists, patiently, quietly, and eternally. And in that quiet, there is peace, there is reflection, and there is the gentle knowledge that even in the smallest gestures, life continues, beautifully, absurdly, and entirely its own.